I never thought I would be the type of person to get into a full-blown war with my neighbor. But here I was, standing in my garage at 11 o'clock at night, staring at an extension cord that snaked from my outdoor outlet all the way across the driveway to the house next door. My name is Nathan Jacobson, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Hills community in Charlotte, North Carolina, for about 8 months. The place was decent enough. A cookie-cutter suburban development with manicured lawns and strict HOA rules that governed everything from mailbox colors to how many hours you could leave your garage door open. I worked as a software engineer from home, which meant I was around the house more than most people, and that turned out to be both a blessing and a curse when it came to noticing things my neighbors were up to. The woman next door was named Brenda Patterson, and she was exactly what you would picture when someone says the word Karen. Mid-40s, blonde hair cut in that distinctive speak to the manager style, and she wore velour tracksuits like it was still 2003. She also happened to be on the HOA board, which she reminded everyone about at least 3 times per conversation. Her husband Roger was some kind of sales manager who traveled constantly for work, leaving Brenda home alone to patrol the neighborhood for violations and make everyone else's life miserable. The extension cord situation started about 3 weeks ago, right as January hit, and the temperatures in Charlotte dropped into the 20s at night. I first noticed it when I was taking out the trash one evening and saw the thick orange cord running from my outdoor outlet, across my driveway, over the small strip of grass between our properties, and disappearing into Brenda's garage through a gap under the door. At first, I thought maybe there was some kind of emergency, like her power was out or something. But when I checked, all her lights were on and I could see the glow of her television through the front window. I stood there for a minute, genuinely confused about what could possibly require her to tap into my electricity. Then I heard it, the distinct hum of a space heater running at full blast. I walked closer to her garage, and sure enough, I could feel the warmth radiating from under the door and hear the constant whir of what sounded like multiple heating units running simultaneously. My first instinct was to just unplug the thing and maybe leave a note, but I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she genuinely thought it was okay to do this, or maybe she was going to come over and ask permission, but just ran the cord first. People do thoughtless things sometimes without malicious intent. So I decided to wait until the next day and have a conversation about it like reasonable adults. The following morning, I walked over to Brenda's house around 9 o'clock and rang the doorbell. She answered wearing one of those velour tracksuits, this one in hot pink, and immediately her face scrunched up like I had interrupted something incredibly important. "Nathan," she said, not quite a question but not quite a greeting either. "Hey Brenda, I noticed you have an extension cord running from my outdoor outlet to your garage. I just wanted to check if everything is okay with your electrical system, or if there is some kind of emergency." She blinked at me like I had just spoken in another language. "Oh, that." "Yes, I am running some heaters in my garage. Roger stores his classic car collection in there, and the temperature control is essential for maintaining the vehicles properly." I waited for her to say something else, like maybe thank you or ask if it was okay, but she just stood there looking at me expectantly. "Right, well, the thing is, that is my electricity you are using. I am paying for that power, and running multiple space heaters is not exactly cheap." Brenda's expression shifted from neutral to annoyed. "It is just a little bit of electricity, Nathan. Don't be so petty. Besides, we are neighbors. Neighbors help each other out." "I would be happy to help out in an actual emergency, but this seems like something you could handle by using your own power outlets." My garage isn't properly wired for the heating capacity I need. The breaker keeps tripping. Roger was supposed to get it fixed before he left for his business trip, but he didn't have time. It is only going to be for a few weeks until he gets back. A few weeks. She wanted to steal my electricity for a few weeks and somehow thought this was reasonable. Brenda, I appreciate the situation, but I cannot let you use my power for weeks at a time. That is going to add a significant amount to my electric bill. You need to either get an electrician out here to fix your garage wiring or find another solution. Her face flushed red, and I could see the Karen rising to the surface. This is exactly the kind of unfriendly, unneighborly behavior that makes communities fall apart. I am on the HOA board, and we value cooperation and mutual support here in Meadowbrook Hills. I would think you would want to maintain good relationships with the people who have authority in this neighborhood. There it was, the thinly veiled threat that she would use her HOA position against me if I didn't comply with her unreasonable request. I am all for being neighborly, but what you are asking isn't reasonable. Please unplug the extension cord from my outlet. If you need electricity in your garage, you need to use your own power or hire someone to fix the problem. Brenda crossed her arms. Fine. But don't come crying to me when you need a favor or when the HOA needs to review any requests you submit. Remember, we take community cooperation very seriously around here. I walked back to my house feeling annoyed but figured that would be the end of it. I had made my position clear, and surely she would respect that and unplug the cord. But when I checked that evening, the cord was still there, still humming with power as it fed her garage heaters. I unplugged it myself and coiled it up, leaving it on her front porch with a note that said, "Please do not use my electrical outlets without permission." The next morning, the cord was plugged back in. This went on for 3 more days. I would unplug it, she would plug it back in. I tried knocking on her door again, but she wouldn't answer even though I could see her car in the driveway and hear her moving around inside. I considered calling the police, but I wasn't sure if this technically qualified as theft or if they would just tell me it was a civil matter. Besides, I didn't want to escalate things to that level if I didn't have to. That is when I decided to document everything. I took photos of the extension cord, timestamps on my phone showing when I would unplug it and when it would reappear. I also started checking my electric meter daily and comparing the readings. Sure enough, my electricity usage had spiked significantly. I did the math, and the extra power draw was costing me about $15 per day. Over a few weeks, that would add up to a few $100s. I sent Brenda an email laying everything out clearly. I attached the photos, showed the math on the electricity costs, and gave her a final warning that if she continued to use my power without permission, I would take further action. Her response came back within an hour. "Nathan, I find your accusations and hostile tone very concerning. As a member of the HOA board, I have a responsibility to ensure that all residents are following community guidelines and maintaining the spirit of neighborly cooperation that makes Meadowbrook Hills such a wonderful place to live. Your recent behavior suggests you may not be a good fit for this community. I will be reviewing your property for any potential violations that may require board attention. Regards, Brenda Patterson, HOA board member." So now it was war. She was going to weaponize the HOA against me because I wouldn't let her steal my electricity. I spent the next few hours going through the entire HOA covenant document, all 73 pages of it, making sure my property was in complete compliance with every single rule. My grass was the right height, my mailbox was the approved color, my trash cans were stored out of sight, everything was perfect. But Brenda was determined. Over the next week, I received 3 violation notices from the HOA. The first claimed my lawn had weeds that exceeded community standards. I took detailed photos showing that my lawn was actually in better condition than most of the neighborhood and submitted a formal appeal. The second notice said my garage door had been left open for more than the allowed 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. This was completely false, as I had been out of town that entire day, which I proved with credit card receipts from a restaurant 90 miles away. The third notice claimed I had been parking a commercial vehicle in my driveway, which was prohibited. The vehicle in question was my regular Honda Civic, which clearly was not a commercial vehicle. Every single violation was bogus, and I successfully appealed each one with documentation. But the process was exhausting and time-consuming, and I knew that was exactly what Brenda wanted. She was trying to make my life so miserable that I would either give in and let her use my electricity or decide to move. Meanwhile, the extension cord kept reappearing no matter how many times I unplugged it. I even bought a locking cover for my outdoor outlet, but Brenda somehow got the cover off and plugged her cord back in anyway. I suspected she might have done it while I was out getting groceries, but I couldn't prove it. That is when I had my breakthrough idea. If Brenda was going to keep plugging into my outdoor outlet, I would simply flip the breaker for that outlet and cut the power. It wouldn't affect anything inside my house, just that one exterior outlet. Let her run her extension cord all she wanted, but she wouldn't get a single watt of electricity from it. I went down to my basement where the electrical panel was located and found the breaker labeled exterior outlets. I flipped it off and smiled. Problem solved. About 2 hours later, I heard aggressive knocking on my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Brenda standing there, her face red and her posture rigid with anger. I considered not answering, but I wanted to hear what she had to say. I opened the door and immediately she started in. "What did you do to your outlet? It is not working." I flipped the breaker off. Since you wouldn't stop using my electricity without permission, I decided the easiest solution was to just cut the power to that outlet. "You cannot do that. I need that electricity." "Then use your own electricity, Brenda. I have told you multiple times that you cannot use mine. This is not complicated." "This is absolutely ridiculous. I am going to report this to the HOA board. This is hostile behavior toward a neighbor." "Go ahead. Report that you are mad because I won't let you steal my electricity. I am sure the board will be very sympathetic." She sputtered for a moment, clearly not used to someone standing up to her. "This isn't over, Nathan. You have made a very big mistake." She stormed off and I closed the door, feeling pretty good about the situation. The breaker stayed off, and I finally got some peace knowing that at least my electricity wasn't being stolen anymore. But Brenda wasn't done. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. This one wasn't a violation notice. It was a summons to appear before the full HOA board at their next meeting to address multiple complaints regarding hostile and unneighborly conduct that is detrimental to the community atmosphere of Meadowbrook Hills. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 in the evening at the community clubhouse. I had a week to prepare, and I decided I was going to use that time wisely. I gathered every piece of documentation I had about the situation with Brenda. Photos of the extension cord, screenshots of my email correspondence, copies of the bogus violation notices she had filed against me, documentation of my successful appeals, records of my electricity usage showing the spike when she was using my power, and calculations of how much money it had cost me. I also did something else. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board about Brenda. I documented everything she had done, including using my electricity without permission, filing false violation notices against me, and threatening to use her position on the board to retaliate against me for not complying with her unreasonable demands. I submitted this complaint 3 days before the meeting, making sure it was officially on record. The night of the meeting arrived, and I showed up at the community clubhouse at 6:45. The clubhouse was a modest building with a large meeting room, a kitchen, and a couple of bathrooms. About 20 people were already there, some board members and some residents who apparently had nothing better to do on a Thursday night than watch HOA drama unfold. The board consisted of 5 people. There was Brenda, of course, along with a retired accountant named Henry Williamson who served as treasurer, a woman named Patricia Chen who was the secretary, a guy named Marcus Rivera who handled architectural review, and the president, a stern-looking woman in her 60s named Dorothy Sullivan. Dorothy called the meeting to order at 7 sharp and went through the standard agenda items, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing the budget for landscaping, and addressing a request from someone who wanted to install a new fence. Finally, about 45 minutes in, she got to my case. Next on the agenda, we have a complaint filed by board member Brenda Patterson regarding resident Nathan Jacobson. Brenda, would you like to present your complaint? Brenda stood up and smoothed her velour tracksuit, this one in navy blue. She had printed out a whole presentation, complete with poster boards that she set up on an easel. She must have spent hours putting this together. Thank you, Dorothy. I am here tonight to address a serious issue regarding Mr. Jacobson and his consistently hostile and uncooperative behavior. As members of this community, we all agree to abide by certain standards of conduct that maintain the pleasant and friendly atmosphere of Meadowbrook Hills. Mr. Jacobson has repeatedly demonstrated that he is unwilling to be a team player or show basic neighborly courtesy. She flipped to her first poster board, which had a blown-up photo of my house with various areas circled in red marker. None of the circles made any sense, but they looked dramatic. Mr. Jacobson has been unresponsive to multiple violation notices, has shown hostility when approached about community matters, and has engaged in behavior specifically designed to make life difficult for his neighbors. Most recently, he deliberately shut off his outdoor electrical outlet for the sole purpose of preventing me from using it, even though I explained that I had a legitimate need due to electrical issues in my own garage. I couldn't help myself. You mean preventing you from stealing my electricity? Dorothy held up her hand. Mr. Jacobson, you will have an opportunity to speak. Please wait your turn. Brenda shot me a triumphant look and continued. As you can see, this is exactly the kind of hostile attitude I am talking about. The use of inflammatory language like stealing when I was simply borrowing a small amount of electricity during a temporary emergency situation shows a complete lack of community spirit. I am requesting that the board issue a formal warning to Mr. Jacobson and require him to turn his outdoor outlet back on immediately. If he continues this pattern of behavior, I believe we should consider more serious consequences, potentially including fines or other enforcement actions. She sat down, looking very pleased with herself. Dorothy turned to me. Mr. Jacobson, would you like to respond? I stood up with my folder of documentation. Yes, thank you. First, I want to address the characterization of my behavior as hostile or unneighborly. The timeline of events tells a very different story. I passed out copies of my documentation to each board member, giving them a moment to look through it. About 3 weeks ago, I discovered that Mrs. Patterson had run an extension cord from my outdoor outlet to her garage without my knowledge or permission. When I approached her about this, She informed me that she was using my electricity to run multiple space heaters for her husband's car collection. She did not ask my permission. She simply stated that she needed it and that I should allow it as a neighborly gesture. She also stated that this would continue for several weeks. I flipped to the next page in my documentation. I politely declined and asked her to use her own electricity. Mrs. Patterson then made it clear that, as a board member, she could make things difficult for me if I didn't cooperate. Over the next several days, every time I unplugged the extension cord, she would plug it back in. I attempted to communicate with her multiple times through both in-person conversation and email, all of which is documented here. Dorothy was frowning as she read through my emails. Patricia, the secretary, looked genuinely surprised. During the time that Mrs. Patterson was using my electricity without permission, my electric bill increased by approximately $15 per day, totaling over $200. This is not a small amount of electricity. This is theft of services, plain and simple. Brenda stood up. That is not true. I was in an emergency situation. An emergency situation because you didn't want to hire an electrician, I replied. That is not an emergency. That is you being cheap and deciding to pass your costs on to me. Dorothy gestured for both of us to sit. Continue, Mr. Jacobson. After I made it clear that Mrs. Patterson could not use my electricity, I began receiving violation notices. 3 notices in 1 week, all of which were either completely false or so minor as to be ridiculous. I successfully appealed every single one with documentation proving that the violations either did not exist or were fabricated. The timing of these notices, immediately after I refused to allow Mrs. Patterson to use my electricity, makes it clear that they were retaliatory in nature. I could see Henry, the treasurer, nodding as he read through the violation notices and my appeals. Finally, when Mrs. Patterson continued to plug her extension cord into my outlet despite my repeated requests for her to stop, I flipped the breaker for that outlet. This is my electrical system, my property, and my right to control. I am not obligated to provide electricity to anyone else, especially someone who has made it clear they have no intention of paying me back or respecting my reasonable boundaries. I pulled out another document. I also want to point out that what Mrs. Patterson has been doing may actually constitute theft under North Carolina General Statute 14-151, which covers theft of utility services. I have chosen not to pursue criminal charges at this time in the hopes that we could resolve this matter within the community, but I want the board to understand the seriousness of what has been happening. The room was silent for a moment. Finally, Dorothy spoke. Mrs. Patterson, is it true that you were using Mr. Jacobson's electricity without his permission? Brenda's face was red. It was a temporary situation. He is making this into a much bigger deal than it needs to be. Did you ask his permission before plugging your extension cord into his outlet? I told him I needed it. That is not the same as asking permission and waiting for an answer, Dorothy said, her voice stern. And did you file violation notices against Mr. Jacobson after he refused to let you use his electricity? I filed legitimate violation notices about actual problems I observed. I stood up again. Problems that were either completely made up or that you could not possibly have observed because I was out of town when they supposedly occurred. I have receipts proving I was 90 miles away when she claimed I left my garage door open for too long. Marcus, the architectural review guy, spoke up for the first time. I actually reviewed those violation notices when they came through, and I remember thinking they seemed a bit excessive, especially all coming at once like that. Dorothy closed the folder in front of her and looked directly at Brenda. Mrs. Patterson. The board takes accusations of retaliation and abuse of power very seriously. Based on the documentation presented here, it appears that you used your position on this board to file false or exaggerated violations against Mr. Jacobson in response to a personal dispute. This is completely unacceptable. I did no such thing, Brenda protested. The timeline makes it very clear, Patricia said quietly, looking up from the documents. All 3 violations were filed within a week of Mr. Jacobson refusing to let you use his electricity. And Mr. Jacobson successfully appealed all of them with strong evidence that they were not legitimate violations. Henry adjusted his glasses. I am also concerned about the theft of electricity. Mrs. Patterson, you understand that taking someone's utilities without permission is not only unethical but potentially illegal, regardless of your reasoning. It was just electricity. It is not like I was breaking into his house. Actually, theft of services is a crime in North Carolina, I said. And given that it cost me over $200, it would likely be classified as a Class 1 misdemeanor, punishable by up to 120 days in jail. Brenda looked genuinely shocked. I don't think it had ever occurred to her that what she was doing could have real legal consequences. She was so used to being in a position of authority in the HOA that she probably thought she was above rules that applied to everyone else. Dorothy took a deep breath. Here is how we are going to handle this. First, Mrs. Patterson, you are to have no further contact with Mr. Jacobson regarding this matter. You will not file any more violation notices concerning his property unless they are reviewed and approved by at least 2 other board members first. Second, you will reimburse Mr. Jacobson for the electricity costs he incurred. Third, you will provide a written apology to Mr. Jacobson acknowledging that you used his electricity without permission and that your subsequent actions were inappropriate. I will not apologize. Brenda practically shouted. I did nothing wrong. Then we will proceed to a vote on whether to remove you from the board for abuse of your position, Dorothy said calmly. All in favor of accepting the resolution as I have outlined it. Henry, Patricia, and Marcus all raised their hands immediately. Dorothy raised her hand as well. Brenda sat there, her face purple with rage. The resolution passes 4-0 with Mrs. Patterson abstaining. Mrs. Patterson, you have 1 week to provide the written apology and reimbursement to Mr. Jacobson. If you do not comply, we will hold a special meeting to vote on your removal from the board. The meeting moved on to other business, but I barely heard any of it. I was too busy processing what had just happened. The board had actually sided with me, and Brenda was being forced to apologize and pay me back. It felt like a huge victory, but I also knew that Brenda was not the type of person to accept defeat gracefully. After the meeting ended, several people came up to me. Marcus shook my hand and apologized for not catching the retaliatory nature of the violations earlier. Patricia told me quietly that she had been concerned about Brenda's behavior for a while and was glad someone had finally stood up to her. Even Dorothy came over and told me that the board would be watching the situation closely to make sure there was no further retaliation. I drove home feeling exhausted but satisfied. I had stood up for myself, documented everything properly, and the system had actually worked the way it was supposed to. Now, I just had to wait and see if Brenda would actually follow through with the apology and reimbursement. 3 days went by with no word from Brenda. I saw her car come and go a few times, but she didn't make any attempt to contact me. On the 4th day, I found an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a check for $235, along with a single sheet of paper. The letter was typed, not handwritten, and it was clear that every word pained her to write. It read, "Mr. Jacobson, I am writing to acknowledge that I used electricity from your outdoor outlet without obtaining your explicit permission. I should have asked before connecting my extension cord, and I should have respected your decision when you declined. I apologize for any inconvenience this caused you. I also apologize for the violation notices that were filed against your property, which upon reflection may have been influenced by my frustration with the situation. I have enclosed reimbursement for your electricity costs. Sincerely, Brenda Patterson." It wasn't the most heartfelt apology I had ever read, and the phrase "may have been influenced" was doing a lot of heavy lifting, but it was in writing and it acknowledged what she had done. That was good enough for me. I deposited the check and filed the letter away with all my other documentation, just in case I needed it in the future. The breaker for my outdoor outlet stayed off for another few weeks, until I was confident that Brenda had found another solution for her garage heating situation. But the story didn't end there. About a month after the board meeting, I was checking my mail when I noticed a moving truck parked in front of Brenda's house. At first, I thought maybe she was just getting some new furniture delivered, but then I saw her and Roger carrying boxes out to the truck. I ran into Roger while we were both getting our mail one afternoon. He looked tired and stressed. "Moving out?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Roger sighed. "Yeah, we are relocating to Raleigh. Brenda's mother had a health issue and we need to be closer to help take care of her. Plus, honestly, Brenda has been really unhappy here ever since that whole thing with the HOA board. She felt like the other board members betrayed her." I didn't know what to say to that. Brenda hadn't been betrayed. She had been held accountable for her actions. But I wasn't going to get into that with Roger, who seemed like a decent enough guy who was just trying to keep the peace. "Well, I hope the move goes smoothly," I said. "Thanks. And hey, for what it is worth, I am sorry about the electricity thing. I had no idea Brenda was doing that until it all blew up. I told her she should have just hired an electrician to fix the garage wiring in the first place, but she didn't want to spend the money. So my suspicion had been correct. She was being cheap and decided to pass the costs on to me rather than paying for a professional to fix her problem. No worries. Water under the bridge at this point." Roger nodded and headed back to his packing. 2 weeks later, the house was empty and a for sale sign went up in the yard. The new neighbors who eventually moved in were a young couple with a toddler. They were friendly and quiet, and most importantly, they never once tried to steal my electricity. I kept the breaker for the outdoor outlet off for several months anyway, just to be safe, but eventually I flipped it back on when I needed it for some yard work. The experience with Brenda taught me a lot about dealing with difficult people and the importance of documentation. If I hadn't kept careful records of everything that happened, the board meeting could have gone very differently. Brenda could have painted me as the unreasonable neighbor, and without evidence to back up my claims, the board might have sided with her simply because she was one of them. I also learned that HOA boards, despite their reputation, can actually be reasonable when presented with facts and evidence. Dorothy and the other board members could have easily circled the wagons around Brenda, but instead they looked at the situation objectively and made the right call. It restored some of my faith in the system, even if it was still far from perfect. Life in Meadowbrook Hills went back to normal after that. I continued working from home, maintaining my property to HOA standards, and generally staying out of drama. I did notice that the HOA seemed to operate a bit more transparently after the incident. Dorothy implemented a new policy requiring that all violation notices be reviewed by at least 2 board members before being sent out, which helped prevent the kind of retaliatory abuse that Brenda had engaged in. I also became more active in HOA meetings, not because I particularly enjoyed them, but because I realized that showing up and staying informed was the best way to protect myself from future issues. I got to know the other residents better and built relationships with people who, it turned out, had also had problems with Brenda over the years. One guy told me she had tried to fine him $50 because his mailbox was the wrong shade of black, even though it was the exact color specified in the HOA guidelines. Another woman said Brenda had filed a noise complaint against her for having a birthday party that ended at 8:30 in the evening, well within the allowed hours for gatherings. Hearing these stories made me realize that I wasn't alone in my experience, and that Brenda had been abusing her position for quite some time. The fact that she eventually moved away probably saved the HOA from having to remove her from the board, which would have been messy and contentious. About 6 months after Brenda moved out, I was at a neighborhood barbecue when Dorothy came up to me with a beer in hand. "You know, I wanted to thank you for bringing that situation with Brenda to our attention," she said. "We had suspected she might be overstepping, but we didn't have concrete evidence until you presented everything at that meeting. It was a wake-up call for the board." "I am just glad it got resolved," I said. "I was worried you all would side with her since she was a board member." Dorothy shook her head. "Being on the board doesn't give anyone the right to abuse their position. If anything, it means we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard." After that meeting, we implemented several new policies to make sure something like that doesn't happen again. I noticed the change with the violation notice review process. That is a good policy. We also added a formal complaint process for residents who feel they are being unfairly targeted. And we are looking at term limits for board members, so we don't end up with people who have been in power too long and start to feel entitled. It was encouraging to hear that some good had come out of the whole mess. Sometimes it takes a conflict to expose problems in a system and create the opportunity for positive change. As the evening wore on and the barbecue started to wind down, I found myself thinking about how the whole situation could have been avoided if Brenda had just approached me differently from the start. If she had knocked on my door and said, "Hey Nathan, I have a problem with my garage wiring and I need to run some heaters until I can get it fixed. Would you be willing to let me use your outdoor outlet for a few days? I will pay you for the electricity," I probably would have said yes. It was her attitude of entitlement, her assumption that she could just take what she wanted because she was on the HOA board, that turned it into a conflict. The whole experience also made me think about power dynamics in communities like this. HOAs are supposed to serve the residents and maintain property values, but they can easily become little fiefdoms where board members wield disproportionate power over their neighbors. The key to keeping them in check is resident participation, transparency, and accountability. When people don't pay attention to what the HOA is doing, bad actors like Brenda can operate with impunity. One unexpected benefit of the whole situation was that I became known in the neighborhood as someone who wouldn't be pushed around. A few months later, when the HOA proposed a special assessment to fund an expensive renovation of the clubhouse, several neighbors came to me to discuss their concerns. Together, we organized and presented an alternative proposal that achieved the necessary improvements at half the cost. The board actually listened and adopted most of our suggestions. I don't think that would have happened if I hadn't established myself as someone who did his homework and stood up for what was right. The incident also changed how I thought about my home and my place in the community. Before all this happened, I kind of kept to myself and didn't think much about HOA politics or neighborhood dynamics. But I realized that being part of a community means being engaged and standing up for yourself and others when necessary. It is not about being confrontational or looking for fights, but about being informed and assertive when your rights are being violated. I kept the documentation from the whole incident in a file folder in my home office, and every now and then I would look through it and remember the lesson it taught me. The photos of the extension cord, the emails, the violation notices, the appeals, the apology letter from Brenda, all of it served as a reminder that sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even when it is uncomfortable or difficult. Winter turned to spring, and then summer arrived with its oppressive North Carolina heat and humidity. My outdoor outlet, which had been at the center of so much drama, now powered my electric lawn mower and occasionally an extension cord when I was doing projects in the garage. Every time I plugged something into it, I couldn't help but smile a little, remembering the battle I had fought and won. The house next door sold to the young couple I mentioned, whose names were Eric and Jennifer Morrison. They had a 3-year-old daughter named Emma who loved to play in their backyard. One Saturday afternoon, Emma's ball rolled into my yard, and she came running after it. I was outside watering some plants and smiled at her. "Is this your ball?" I asked, picking it up. She nodded shyly. "Here you go. What is your name?" "Emma," she said quietly. Jennifer came hurrying over. "I am so sorry, Emma, you need to ask before going into someone else's yard." "It is totally fine," I assured her. "She is welcome to come get her ball anytime." We chatted for a few minutes, and I learned that they had moved from a townhouse in downtown Charlotte and were excited to have more space and a yard for Emma to play in. They seemed like genuinely nice people, and I was grateful that they were nothing like Brenda. Over the next few months, Eric and I developed a friendly neighbor relationship. We would wave when we saw each other, occasionally chat about lawn care or home improvement projects, and help each other out when needed. One time his lawn mower broke down and I let him borrow mine. Another time I was trying to move a heavy piece of furniture, and he came over to help. It was the kind of normal, healthy, neighborly relationship that should exist, based on mutual respect and reciprocity, rather than entitlement and power plays. As the 1-year anniversary of the Brenda situation approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. The HOA board had become more accountable and transparent. The neighborhood felt more cohesive because residents were more engaged. And I had grown as a person, learning to stand up for myself and document everything carefully when dealing with potential conflicts. I also started thinking about the apology letter that Brenda had written. At the time, I had accepted it as adequate even though it wasn't particularly heartfelt. But looking back, I realized that the important thing wasn't whether Brenda truly felt sorry for what she had done. What mattered was that she had been held accountable, that there were consequences for her actions, and that the system had worked to protect my rights as a homeowner. The written apology served as an official acknowledgement of wrongdoing, something that could be referenced if there were ever future disputes. It was a paper trail, a record that couldn't be disputed or reinterpreted later. That was why Dorothy had insisted on it being in writing rather than accepting a verbal apology. Smart move on her part. I ran into Dorothy again at another HOA meeting, this one focused on updating the landscaping plan for the common areas. Afterward, we stood in the parking lot talking. "You know, that situation with Brenda really changed how we operate as a board," Dorothy said. "We used to be pretty informal about things, but now we have processes and checks and balances. It is more work, but it is better for everyone." "I appreciate that," I said. "It makes residents feel like the board is accountable." "That is exactly what we are going for." We also added a new board member, a younger guy named Travis who works in compliance for a bank. He has really helped us think through policies and procedures to prevent conflicts of interest and abuse of power. Sounds like positive changes all around. Dorothy smiled. Sometimes it takes a crisis to make things better. I just wish it hadn't had to be such a mess to get there. We said goodbye and I drove home, thinking about her words. She was right that sometimes it takes a crisis to catalyze change. If I had just given in to Brenda's demands and let her use my electricity, nothing would have changed. She would have continued to abuse her position. Other residents would have continued to be intimidated by her, and the board would have continued to operate with inadequate oversight. By standing up and forcing the issue, I had inadvertently created an opportunity for the whole system to improve. That night, I sat on my back porch with a beer and looked out at my yard. The grass was neatly mowed, the hedges were trimmed, and everything was in compliance with HOA standards. Not because I was afraid of getting a violation notice, but because I took pride in my property and wanted it to look nice. That was how it should be. The HOA should encourage and support residents in maintaining their properties, not use rules as weapons in personal disputes. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Mike, who lived across town in a neighborhood without an HOA. "How's life in HOA land?" he asked. Mike loved to tease me about living in a planned community with all its rules and restrictions. "Actually, pretty good," I texted back. "Had some drama last year, but it got sorted out. That's the problem with HOAs. Always drama. Drama can happen anywhere. At least here we have a structure for dealing with it." Mike sent back a laughing emoji, but I meant what I said. Yes, HOAs can be frustrating and overly restrictive, but they also provide a framework for resolving disputes and maintaining community standards. The key is making sure that framework is fair and that the people in power are held accountable. The following week, I got an email from the HOA announcing that they were looking for volunteers to serve on various committees. There were openings on the Architectural Review Committee, the Landscaping Committee, and the Social Events Committee. On a whim, I decided to apply for the Architectural Review Committee. I figured if I was going to live in this community, I might as well have a say in how things were run. A few days later, Marcus Rivera, who chaired the Architectural Review Committee, called me. "Hey Nathan, I got your application to join the committee. I would love to have you. We meet once a month and review any requests for modifications to properties, like additions, fences, paint colors, that sort of thing." "Sounds good. What is the time commitment like?" "Usually just the monthly meeting, which is about 2 hours. Occasionally we have to do a site visit if there is a complicated request, but it is pretty manageable." "I am in," I said, and just like that, I went from being an uninvolved resident to being part of the HOA governance structure. It felt like the right move, a way to stay engaged and make sure the kind of abuse that Brenda had perpetrated didn't happen again. My first committee meeting was on a Tuesday evening in September. There were 5 of us on the committee, including Marcus and me, plus a retired contractor named Bill who had a lot of practical knowledge about construction, a real estate agent named Melissa who understood property values and market trends, and a landscape architect named Tom who consulted on any requests involving outdoor modifications. The meeting was straightforward and businesslike. We reviewed 3 requests. Someone wanted to build a deck, someone wanted to paint their house a slightly different shade of beige than what was currently approved, and someone wanted to install a fence in their backyard. We discussed each request, asked clarifying questions, and ultimately approved all 3 with minor modifications. What struck me was how reasonable everyone was. There was no power tripping, no arbitrary decisions, just thoughtful discussion about whether each request was appropriate and in line with community standards. It was such a contrast to how Brenda had operated, using her position to advance personal vendettas rather than serve the community. After the meeting, Marcus pulled me aside. "I am really glad you joined the committee. We need more residents who understand that this is about serving the community, not wielding power." "That is why I applied," I said. "After everything that happened last year, I wanted to be part of the solution." Marcus nodded. "That whole situation with Brenda was a real eye-opener for a lot of us. I feel bad that I didn't push back harder on those bogus violation notices she filed against you. I suspected they were retaliatory, but I didn't want to rock the boat." "You did speak up at the board meeting when it mattered," I reminded him. "That made a difference." "Yeah, but I should have said something sooner. Lesson learned." As I drove home that night, I felt good about my decision to get more involved. Being on the Architectural Review Committee gave me insight into how the HOA actually functioned and allowed me to have a positive impact on the community. It also meant I would see any concerning patterns early, like if a board member started filing a bunch of violation notices against someone they had a personal grudge against. The months passed, and life in Meadowbrook Hills continued to be peaceful. I served on the Architectural Review Committee and actually found it interesting. Each request told a story about the people who lived in the community and what they valued. The family building a deck wanted more outdoor living space. The couple repainting their house wanted to put their own stamp on their property while still fitting in with the neighborhood aesthetic. The family installing a fence had just adopted a dog and needed to keep it safe in the yard. Winter came around again, marking a full year since the whole situation with Brenda had begun. On a cold January evening, I was in my garage working on a woodworking project when I realized I needed to plug in my sander. I reached for the extension cord and looked at my outdoor outlet, the same outlet that had been the center of so much conflict. I plugged in the cord, and the sander hummed to life. As I worked, I thought about how something so simple and mundane had become the focal point of a much larger battle about respect, boundaries, and accountability. It all could have been avoided with basic courtesy and communication, but instead, it had escalated into HOA hearings and written apologies. The situation had cost me time, stress, and a fair amount of money in electricity before I got reimbursed. But it had also taught me valuable lessons and ultimately led to positive changes in how the HOA operated. So, in a weird way, I was almost grateful it had happened, as frustrating as it had been at the time. I finished my woodworking project and put my tools away, unplugging the sander and coiling up the extension cord. As I walked back into my house, I glanced over at the house next door where Brenda used to live. The lights were on, and I could see Eric and Jennifer moving around inside, probably getting Emma ready for bed. It was a good reminder that situations change, difficult people move on, and life goes back to normal. That night, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw that Brenda had posted something public. I normally wouldn't have looked, but curiosity got the better of me. She had posted a photo of herself at what looked like an HOA meeting in her new neighborhood in Raleigh, with a caption that said, "Excited to be joining the Pineview Estates HOA board. Looking forward to serving this wonderful community." I stared at the post for a moment, then laughed and shook my head. Of course she had joined another HOA board. Some people never learn. I felt a brief moment of sympathy for the residents of Pineview Estates, whoever they were, but then I reminded myself that it wasn't my problem anymore. Brenda was someone else's headache now. I closed Facebook and went to bed, sleeping soundly in my house in Meadowbrook Hills, where my electricity was my own, and my outdoor outlet was mine to use as I pleased. The extension cord was coiled up in my garage, ready for legitimate projects. The breaker was on, and most importantly, I had learned to stand up for myself, document everything, and never back down when I was in the right. The experience with Brenda had been exhausting and frustrating, but it had made me a more engaged member of my community and taught me the importance of accountability and transparency in neighborhood governance. Sometimes the worst experiences teach us the most valuable lessons, and sometimes standing up to a bully leads to positive changes that benefit everyone. As I drifted off to sleep, my last thought was about that written apology tucked away in my file folder. It was more than just words on a page. It was proof that the system could work, that bullies could be held accountable, and that sometimes doing the right thing, even when it is difficult, leads to a better outcome for everyone involved. And that was worth more than all the electricity Brenda could ever have stolen.